In this video, I want to motivate some of the sources of bias that we may see in our samples by using a case study. The case study we will look at in particular deals with the 1936 US presidential election. Now, when I was doing my research about this, I got some Google results that told me that this appeared in US AP history classes or AP statistics classes. I mean, I didn't go to school in the US and I didn't take any AP classes, so I had never heard of this before Data 100, but maybe you have. In the 1936 US presidential election, Franklin D. Roosevelt, who is the sitting president, and he was a Democrat, that's him here on the left, went up for re-election against Alf Landon, who was a Republican, here on the right. And, as per usual, polls tried to predict the outcome of the election in the months leading up to it. The Literary Digest was a magazine, and they were pretty reputable. They had successfully predicted the outcome of 5 general elections coming into 1936, so they were pretty good at predicting who was going to win. For the 1936 federal election, they sent out their survey to 10 million individuals. Now, at the time, there wasn't one definitive list of all eligible voters, and so the way they found people to include in their survey was by looking at people who were in phone books, and people who were in lists of magazine subscribers, and people who were country club members. Any way they could get lists of people who would be eligible to vote. So, you might be thinking 10 million people, that's a lot. They must have accurately predicted the outcome of the election, right? They were, in fact, very wrong. So the Literary Digest predicted that Franklin Roosevelt would win 43% of the vote, and in turn lose to Alf Landon, who would win 57% of the vote. In actuality, Franklin Roosevelt won 61% of the vote in a landslide victory over Alf Landon, who only got 37% of the vote. So you may be wondering, how could this have happened? They surveyed 10 million people. And so there are 2 sources of bias that are at play here, and we are about to formalize specific names for each of these types of bias. But for now, let's just examine what happened. Firstly, the way they chose people to be included in their sample was not representative of the overall population. If you remember back here, we established that they found people to sample from looking at phone books and lists of magazine subscribers and country club members, and I believe also people who owned cars, who at the time tended to be more affluent, and at the time, these people tended to vote Republican primarily. And so the people they were sampling tended to support the Republican candidate, and so it's no surprise that their prediction was that the Republican candidate would win, when in actuality, in the larger population of all people eligible to vote in the US, that sentiment of supporting the Republican candidate was not as strong in that election year. So they were sampling primarily Republican voters, so they predicted that the Republican candidate would win. The other issue going on here was that, sure, they sent their survey to 10 million people, which is a lot, but only 2.4 million people actually filled out the survey, which is 24%, which is a pretty low response rate. And so the other phenomenon going on here is that it likely was the case that the people who had strong opinions for their support for Alf Landon chose to fill out the survey, and the other 76% didn't really care about expressing their opinions on this poll. And so, this phenomenon is called non-response bias. We have no idea how the other 76% of people who received the survey but didn't fill it out would have voted. Now, at the same time that the Literary Digest was doing their polling, this young statistician by the name of George Gallup also decided to make predictions about the 1936 elections, and he sampled just 50,000 people, but was able to predict that Roosevelt would win with 56% of the vote. So he correctly predicted the outcome of the election, though the proportion of votes that would go to Roosevelt, he was often predicting that by about 5%, which by today's standards is pretty bad, but he still was able to predict that Roosevelt would win with a far smaller sample size, and this just indicates that he constructed a representative sample of the larger population of US voters. Now, George Gallup was a clever man, and he decided to predict what the Literary Digest was going to predict. So you can think of this as prediction inception. He did this by realizing that the Literary Digest, and however, I'm not sure how he came up with this, but he realized that the Literary Digest would be sampling people from phone books and lists of magazine subscribers and lists of country club members. And so he went out and constructed a sample of those same people. And using information from those people, he was able to predict what the Literary Digest was going to predict. And he was able to do that within 1%. So he got the Literary Digest's prediction almost spot on. And he did this with a very small sample of just 3,000 people. So the moral of the story here is that a larger sample size doesn't necessarily mean your sample will be better, right? And we can see here the Literary Digest poll surveyed 10 million people and were by far the furthest away from what the actual proportion for votes for Roosevelt would be, right? They predicted that 43% of people would vote for Roosevelt. In actuality, 61% of people voted for Roosevelt. So a big sample isn't always a good sample.